Humiliation is a bitter pill, but vengeance served legally cold is a rare delicacy. When a high society scandal erupted, catching a prominent developer in a hotel lobby with a 22-year-old model on a viral live stream, everyone expected his quiet, devoted wife to simply crumble. Instead, she sits upright in a mahogany-paneled courtroom, watching her soon-to-be ex-husband arrogantly demand the keys to their sprawling, custom-built Hamptons estate. He flashes a blinding, confident smile at the judge, utterly convinced he has outmaneuvered her. What this deeply narcissistic man doesn't realize, as he swears on the Bible to tell the truth, is that he is actively, legally evicting himself. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 302 swung shut, sealing the suffocating tension inside. Morning sunlight sliced through the tall, arched windows of the New York County Courthouse, catching the dust motes dancing above the varnished defense and plaintiff tables. Judge Mary Caldwell, a woman whose stern reputation preceded her by a country mile, adjusted her reading glasses and stared down from the bench. She had presided over hundreds of high-net-worth divorces, but the sheer, palpable audacity radiating from the petitioner's table this morning was enough to make even her seasoned eyes narrow. At that table sat David Montgomery. David was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon, clad in a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than the court reporter's annual salary. He leaned back in his leather chair, whispering something entirely too amusing to his attorney, Bradley Jenkins. Bradley, a bulldog of a litigator known for his aggressive, scorched-earth tactics in family court, offered a sycophantic chuckle. What made David's relaxed demeanor so incredibly jarring was the context of their presence. Just 3 months prior, David had become the undisputed villain of the tri-state area. During the prestigious Monroe Foundation Charity Gala, an event heavily attended by Manhattan's elite and heavily covered by the press, David had slipped away from his wife. He had wandered into a supposedly secluded alcove of the Waldorf Astoria to engage in a highly passionate, incredibly explicit rendezvous with Jessica Pierce, a 22-year-old Instagram influencer whose primary talent seemed to be finding cameras. Unfortunately for David, he hadn't noticed the hot microphone left active by a roaming documentary crew covering the charity event. His breathless promises to Jessica, "I'm dumping the old ball and chain, baby. The Hamptons house is going to be ours," echoed through the grand ballroom's secondary speaker system before the AV team could cut the feed. The live stream of the gala had captured the entire audio, immortalizing his infidelity for millions of viewers across social media. Yet, in a display of staggering narcissism, it was David who had filed for divorce the very next morning. His PR team spun a frantic narrative claiming he was trapped in an emotionally barren marriage and was seeking his rightful happiness. In his legal filings, David was ruthlessly demanding he wanted 50% of their liquid assets, full ownership of his development company, Montgomery Holdings, and most crucially, the crown jewel of their portfolio, the $6.5 million estate in Southampton. Across the aisle, sitting with the stillness of a marble statue, was Caroline Hayes. Caroline did not look like a broken woman. She wore a tailored, understated navy blue dress. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. There were no dark circles under her eyes, no tremble in her hands as she neatly aligned a stack of manila folders on the table before her. Where David was putting on a theatrical performance of the weary but triumphant businessman, Caroline was terrifyingly composed. Beside her sat Arthur Pennylygon. Arthur was a legend in legal circles, a man who rarely took on divorce cases anymore unless they presented an intellectual puzzle he couldn't resist. With his silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a tweed suit that looked deliberately unpretentious, Arthur resembled a tired Oxford professor more than a legal shark. But those who had faced him knew that Arthur's grandfatherly demeanor was a bear trap. "All right, counselors." Judge Caldwell's voice cracked through the microphone, silencing the low hum of the gallery. She cast a brief, disdainful glance toward the second row where Jessica Pierce, the mistress herself, had actually dared to show up. wearing a designer trench coat and oversized sunglasses indoors. "We are here for the matter of Montgomery v. Hayes. Mr. Hassos, Mr. Tumman. Jenkins, I understand your client is eager to proceed with his petition regarding the division of real property, specifically the residence located on Dune Road, Southampton." "Yes, Your Honor." Bradley Jenkins stood up, buttoning his suit up but hanging his suit jacket with a flourish. "My client is simply asking for what is fair and equitable, or rather what is rightfully his. Mr. Montgomery was the sole breadwinner. He is the visionary who purchased the land, commissioned the architects, and funded every single nail driven into that property. We intend to prove that Miss Hayes contributed nothing financially to the acquisition or the upkeep of the Southampton estate. Giving her any claim to that property would be a gross miscarriage of justice." Arthur Penhaligon didn't stand. He didn't object. He simply leaned over and pushed a single thin file toward Caroline. She didn't open it. She just rested her manicured hand flat on top of it, her eyes locked on David. David met her gaze and offered a smug, patronizing smile. He mouthed the words, "It's over." Caroline didn't blink. She just offered a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, David," she thought, tracing the edge of the closed folder. "It absolutely is." The morning proceeded with the agonizing slowness typical of family court. Bradley Jenkins called his first and only witness for this segment of the trial, his own client, David Montgomery. David took the stand with the confident stride of a man walking onto a stage to accept an award. He swore the oath loudly, making sure to make eye contact with the judge, attempting to turn on the famous Montgomery charm that had secured him millions in real estate investments. "Mr. Montgomery," Jenkins began, pacing in front of the witness stand, "let's talk about the Dune Road property. Can you describe for the court the emotional and financial investment you poured into this home?" David sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "It was my magnum opus, Mr. Jenkins. I work 60, sometimes 70-hour weeks in commercial real estate. Manhattan is a concrete jungle. I wanted a sanctuary. I found the plot in Southampton 5 years ago. It was a teardown, an absolute wreck, but I saw the vision. I personally negotiated the purchase price down to $2 million. Then I poured another $4.5 million into the construction. And did your wife, Miss Hayes, contribute to this financial endeavor?" Jenkins asked, his voice dripping with theatrical incredulity. David offered a sad, patronizing smile. "Caroline, no. Caroline is, well, she has her hobbies. She volunteers, she manages the household staff. But the capital, the sweat equity? That was entirely me. Every invoice from the Italian marble suppliers, every check to the landscape architects, it all came from my hard work. That house is the physical manifestation of my life's work. To lose it now, after the unfortunate breakdown of our marriage, would be devastating." In the gallery, Jessica Pierce visibly pouted in sympathy, adjusting her sunglasses. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery," Jenkins said, turning toward Arthur Penhaligon with a smug grin. "Your witness." Arthur stood up slowly. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, picked up the single sheet of paper, and meandered toward the center of the room. He didn't look angry, he looked mildly confused, like a man trying to remember where he left his car keys. "Mr. Montgomery," Arthur began, his voice raspy and gentle, "you paint a very vivid picture. A true pioneer of the Hamptons. You stated you personally negotiated the purchase of the land. Is that correct?" "That's correct," David said, puffing out his chest. "And you oversaw the finances. You tracked every penny. I am a meticulous businessman, Mr. Penhaligon. You don't build an empire by letting others manage your money." "Fascinating," Arthur murmured, looking down at his piece of paper. "Now, you are the sole owner of Montgomery Holdings, LLC, correct?" "Yes. And when you purchased this property 5 years ago, you were deeply entangled in a rather complex commercial zoning lawsuit regarding a high-rise in Tribeca. Do you recall that?" David frowned, the first crack in his confident facade appearing. "I deal with lawsuits, All the time. It's the nature of real estate. What does that have to do with my home? Bear with me, Mr. Montgomery, Arthur said politely. During that specific time, your personal assets were heavily leveraged. In fact, a temporary lien was threatened against Montgomery Holdings. To protect your capital, your accountants advised you to make the Southampton purchase through an entirely different legal entity. Does that refresh your memory? David waved his hand dismissively. We used a shell corporation for the initial acquisition. Standard practice to maintain privacy. It was called Seascape Ventures. Seascape Ventures LLC, Arthur corrected gently. Yes. Now, you testified just moments ago that you funded this purchase. You paid the $2 million for the land. Absolutely. Arthur walked back to his table and picked up a thicker stack of documents. He handed copies to the bailiff to pass to the judge and to Bradley Jenkins. Your Honor, I am submitting Defense Exhibit A. These are the certified bank records for Seascape Ventures LLC from the month of the property closing. Arthur turned back to David. Mr. Montgomery, would you mind reading the origin account for the $2 million wire transfer that funded the purchase? David squinted at the paper handed to him. It says it came from an account ending in 449. And do you recognize that account, Mr. Montgomery? It's a wealth management account. Probably one of my secondary holding accounts at Chase. Arthur smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Actually, Mr. Montgomery, if you look at page 3, you will see the account holder's name. Could you read it for the court? David flipped the page. He stared at the line. He blinked, clearly thrown off balance. He looked over at his lawyer, Jenkins, who was suddenly furiously flipping through his own copy of the documents. Read it, Mr. Montgomery, Judge Caldwell commanded, leaning forward. It says, the Caroline Hayes Trust, David muttered, his voice dropping an octave. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Arthur cupped a hand to his ear. The Caroline Hayes Trust, David snapped. But that doesn't mean anything. I replenished that account later. We moved money around all the time. Did you? Arthur asked, his voice suddenly losing its grandfatherly warmth and turning sharp as a razor. We have subpoenaed your financial records for the past 5 years, Mr. Montgomery. We found no such replenishment. The initial $2 million came from my client's inheritance. But let us move past the purchase. Let us talk about the construction. The $4.5 million in Italian marble and imported oak you so poetically described. Arthur handed another folder to the bailiff. Defense Exhibit B, Your Honor. The final deed of trust and the master property title filed with Suffolk County. Bradley Jenkins stood up, his face flushed. Objection, Your Honor. I fail to see the relevance of the initial funding if the property was deeded jointly as marital property. Overruled, Mr. Passon Jenkins, Judge Caldwell said, her eyes blue to the documents Arthur had just submitted. I am very interested to see where Mr. Penhaligon is going with this. Thank you, Your Honor, Arthur said, stepping right up to the wooden rail of the witness stand. Mr. Montgomery, you are a meticulous businessman. You sign hundreds of contracts. When the construction was finished, the property title was formally transferred from the shell company, Seascape Ventures, to its permanent owner. You were present at that closing, were you not? I was, David said, his jaw tightening. I signed the paperwork in my attorney's office. Are you sure you read the paperwork, David? Arthur asked softly. David sneered. Of course I read it. I own that house. Ugh. Not that shoe Dutch. Arthur pointed to the document in David's hand. Then please, read the name listed under grantee on the master deed. The sole legal owner of the property located on June Road. David looked down at the paper. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, scanning for David Montgomery or Montgomery Holdings. His eyes stopped. The color violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogant millionaire smile was entirely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Would you like me to read it for you, Mr. Montgomery? Arthur asked, the silence in the courtroom suddenly deafening. David didn't answer. He just stared at the piece of paper, his hands beginning to shake. Arthur turned his back to the witness stand and faced the gallery, his voice ringing out clearly. The sole legal owner of the property, as filed, stamped, and legally cemented 5 years ago, without a single objection from the meticulous businessman sitting before us, is Caroline Hayes. Pandemonium erupted at the petitioner's table. Bradley Jenkins sprang from his chair so violently it tipped backward, hitting the varnished floor with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Objection, Your Honor," Jenkins bellowed, his face a mottled, furious red. "This is an ambush. We were not provided with this deed during discovery." "Mr. Jenkins, lower your voice," Judge Caldwell snapped, banging her gavel once. "And spare me the theatrics. I have the discovery logs right here. Exhibit B was filed and submitted to your office 30 days ago, buried in a box of financial disclosures. If you or your paralegals fail to review the very title of the property you are attempting to divide, that is a failure of your own firm, not an ambush by the defense." David Montgomery was still staring at the piece of paper in his hands as if it were coated in poison. His chest heaved, his expensive Tom Ford suit suddenly looking tight and constricting. "This is a mistake," he stammered, looking frantically between his lawyer and the judge. "This is a clerical error. It was supposed to be in my name. I paid for it. It was my project." Arthur Peneligon adjusted his glasses and looked at David with an expression of profound, almost pitying patience. "A clerical error on a master deed filed in Suffolk County, Mr. Montgomery, a document you personally signed in the presence of a notary public." "I sign hundreds of documents a week," David shouted, his polished demeanor shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "My attorneys hand me a stack of papers, point to the dotted line, and I sign. I didn't read the fine print, but the intent was clear. It was my money, and I just used her trust account temporarily to bypass a freeze on my primary assets." Silence descended upon the courtroom. Even the court reporter's fingers paused over her stenograph machine. Arthur's eyes gleamed with the sharp, predatory light of a trap springing shut. He didn't look at David. He looked directly at Judge Caldwell. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet volume, "let the record reflect that the petitioner just admitted under oath to intentionally moving funds and obfuscating property ownership to bypass a legal freeze on his assets during the 2019 Tribeca zoning litigation." David froze. He looked at Jenkins, who had suddenly turned the color of old parchment. Jenkins slowly sank back into his chair, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Montgomery," Arthur continued, turning back to the witness stand and stepping closer. "In legal terms, this is known as a fraudulent conveyance. You deliberately transferred assets into your wife's name to shield them from potential creditors and civil judgments. You used her name and her clean financial record as a human shield for your empire. That's just business." David scoffed, though his voice lacked its previous volume. "Everyone does it. You protect the capital. But between a husband and wife, it's still joint property. We both knew the deal." "Did you?" Arthur asked, "because my client never signed any secondary agreement relinquishing her rights to the property. When you deeded the house solely to Caroline Hayes to protect your own skin, you made a legal gift. The law is very clear, Mr. Montgomery. Under the doctrine of unclean hands, a court of equity will not assist a person who has acted in bad faith. You cannot hide an asset in your wife's name to defraud your creditors, and then come to this court begging for us to undo the transaction just because you decided you'd rather sleep with a 22-year-old. Noctio. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the gallery. In the second row, Jessica Pierce shrank down into her trench coat, pulling her oversized sunglasses tighter against her face. Judge Caldwell leaned over the bench, her expression as hard as granite. "Mr. Montgomery, Are you asking this court to essentially enforce a fraud? You want me to declare that the deed is invalid because your true intention was to hide your money from a legitimate lawsuit? No, Your Honor, David stuttered, desperately looking to Jenkins for a lifeline. But Jenkins was staring at his legal pad entirely out of place. If he argued that David owned the house, he was admitting his client committed financial fraud. If he admitted the transfer was legal, Carolyn owned the Hamptons estate free and clear. The house belongs to Miss Hayes, Arthur stated, turning his back on David as if the man were no longer worth his time. Purchased with her trust funds legally deeded in her name alone and maintained by her for the last 5 years while Mr. Montgomery lived there essentially as a heavily subsidized guest. We ask that the petition to divide the June Road property be dismissed with prejudice. Motion granted. Judge Caldwell ruled immediately, making a sharp notation on her file. The Southampton property is entirely the separate, non-marital asset of the respondent, Caroline Hayes. The petitioner will vacate the premises and remove his personal belongings within 72 hours. David gripped the wooden railing of the witness stand so tightly his knuckles turned white. The $6.5 million sanctuary, the custom wine cellar, the imported marble floors gone. With a single strike of a gavel, his crowning achievement had been handed over to the woman he had publicly humiliated. He looked across the room at Caroline. She was sitting with her hands neatly folded in her lap. For the first time all morning she looked directly into his eyes, and the corner of her mouth twitched upward into a faint, chilling smile. Sitting rigidly in the spectator gallery, Jessica Pierce was having a very difficult morning. When David had promised her the world in that walled-off Astoria alcove, he had painted a vivid, intoxicating picture. Weekends in the Hamptons, completely unrestricted access to the platinum cards, and the prestige of being the new Mrs. Montgomery. Jessica had tolerated the massive public backlash and the loss of several brand sponsorships because she believed the ultimate payout was secure. David was a titan. Titans didn't lose in court to their quiet charity board wives. But watching David stagger back to his table looking physically ill, a cold knot of panic began to tighten in Jessica's stomach. The Hamptons' house was gone. That was the primary location for her planned summer content. "All right," Bradley Jenkins whispered furiously to David as the developer slumped into his chair. "We lost the house. It's a blow, but it's not fatal. We still have the company. Montgomery Holdings is where the real cash flow is. We pivot. We go after the liquid assets, the investment portfolios, and we protect your majority stake in the business." She doesn't know a thing about commercial real estate. David nodded sharply, trying to pull his fractured composure back together. He adjusted his tie and took a deep breath. "Right, the company. I built it from the ground up. She can't touch Montgomery Holdings." "Your Honor," Jenkins announced, standing up and attempting to project confidence. Moving on from the matter of the residence, we turn to the division of marital assets and business valuations. Mr. Montgomery is the founder and CEO of Montgomery Holdings. We have submitted a fair valuation of the company at roughly $42 million. We are prepared to offer Ms. Hayes a generous buyout of 10%, recognizing her passive support during the marriage, provided she waives any claimed alimony. Right. Judge Caldwell raised an eyebrow. 10%, Mr. Jenkins. For a marriage that lasted 12 years. Ms. Hayes played absolutely no role in the generation of that wealth, Your Honor, Jenkins argued. She did not sit on the board. She did not negotiate the acquisitions. Giving her half of the company she doesn't understand would cripple its operational capacity. Arthur Peneligon rose slowly, bringing another manila folder with him. He walked over to Caroline, who finally opened the file resting under her hand. She pulled out a single, heavily redacted document and handed it to Arthur. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice smooth and conversational. "Mr. Jenkins speaks passionately about his client's brilliant corporate leadership. And it is true Mr. Montgomery is the CEO. He holds the title. He has the corner office. He does the interviews with Forbes. Arthur walked toward the center of the room. But titles can be quite misleading, wouldn't you agree, David? David glared at him. I own my company. I hold all the voting shares. You did, Arthur corrected softly. Right up until the market crash of 2020. David's breath hitched. Let's take a walk down memory lane, Arthur addressed the court. In the spring of 2020, commercial real estate took an unprecedented hit. Montgomery Holdings was over-leveraged on 3 massive commercial projects in Midtown. The banks called in the loans. The company was facing immediate, catastrophic bankruptcy. Objection relevance. Jenkins called out, though he sounded less certain this time. Overruled. Go on, Mr. Nath Ben Haligom, the judge said, leaning forward, utterly captivated. To save his empire, Mr. Montgomery needed an emergency influx of capital. Specifically, he needed $12 million in liquid cash within 48 hours to satisfy the creditors. No bank would touch him. His investor friends had all vanished. Arthur stopped in front of David's table. So he went to his wife. Caroline sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the judge. My client, Miss Hayes, is the sole beneficiary of the Hayes industrial fortune, Arthur explained. A fact Mr. Montgomery was intimately aware of. He begged her to bail him out, and she did, but Caroline Hayes is not a foolish woman. She did not simply hand her husband $12 million. She executed a corporate buyout. Nout. Mirth. Arthur handed the document to the bailiff. Defense Exhibit C, Your Honor. The Emergency Restructuring Agreement of Montgomery Holdings dated April 14, 2020. Signed by David Montgomery. David was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide, unblinking. If you turn to page 7, Your Honor, Arthur guided the court, you will see the terms of the capital injection. In exchange for the $12 million that saved the company from immediate dissolution, David Montgomery transferred 51% of the voting shares of Montgomery Holdings LLC to a blind trust. Arthur turned to David. And who is the sole trustee and beneficiary of that blind trust, David? The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air-conditioning vents. David swallowed hard. His voice was barely a whisper. Caroline, I'm sorry. Arthur cupped his ear again, a masterful display of theatrical cruelty. Caroline. David shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and despair. But it was a formality. It was just on paper to satisfy her financial advisors. I still run the company. I make all the decisions. You run the company at the pleasure of the majority shareholder, Arthur corrected, his voice turning to steel. You are an employee, Mr. Montgomery. A highly compensated employee, yes, but an employee nonetheless. You do not own Montgomery Holdings. Caroline Hayes owns Montgomery Holdings. She owns you. Bradley Jenkins dropped his pen. It rolled off the table and clattered onto the floor. He didn't bend down to pick it up. Furthermore, Arthur continued, delivering the final devastating blow. As the majority shareholder, my client convened an emergency board meeting yesterday evening. Arthur pulled a final sheet of paper from his pocket and laid it gently on the petitioner's table, right in front of David. This is your formal notice of termination, Mr. Montgomery, effective immediately. You are being let go from Montgomery Holdings due to violations of the company's morality clause, specifically bringing catastrophic public embarrassment to the brand. David stared at the termination letter. The letterhead bore the logo he had designed himself. You can't do this, David whispered, staring at Caroline. You can't take everything. Caroline finally spoke. Her voice was calm, melodic, and completely devoid of mercy. I didn't take anything, David. You gave it all to me, and then you threw it away. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in courtroom 302 was the frantic scratching of the court reporter's machine. David Montgomery stared at the embossed company logo on his termination letter, his mind violently rejecting the reality printed in crisp black ink. He had built Montgomery Holdings. He was the face on the industry magazine covers. The idea that his quiet, philanthropic wife had systematically orchestrated his ouster from behind the curtain of a blind trust was entirely incomprehensible to his narcissistic ego. "This is a joke," David finally choked out, his voice thin and reedy. He shoved the paper back across the table. "You can't fire the founder. I'll tie this up in litigation for the next decade. I'll bleed the company dry in legal fees before I let you take my chair. You are welcome to try, Mr. Montgomery," Arthur Penhaligon replied mildly, stepping back toward his own table. "However, fighting a multi-million-dollar corporate litigation requires capital. Capital that you currently do not possess. Which brings us, Your Honor, to the matter of spousal support." Bradley Jenkins, who looked as though he had aged 10 years in the last hour, suddenly snapped his head up. A desperate feral light ignited in the lawyer's eyes. He saw a lifeline. "Yes, exactly, Your Honor." Jenkins scrambled to his feet, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. "My client has just been maliciously terminated from his primary source of income. He's been stripped of his residence. As of this exact moment, Mr. Montgomery is technically unemployed and effectively homeless. Given the staggering wealth now consolidated in Ms. Hayes' possession, we are formally petitioning for immediate rehabilitative spousal support. She cannot leave him destitute." A low murmur of disbelief rippled through the gallery. The audacity of a man publicly cheating on his wife, attempting to steal her house, and then demanding alimony when outmaneuvered was staggering. Judge Caldwell pinched the bridge of her nose, clearly fighting the urge to rub her temples. "Mr. Jenkins," the judge said, her voice dripping with dangerous restraint, "are you seriously asking this court to mandate that Miss Hayes pay alimony to the man she just fired for cause after he committed financial fraud to hide assets from creditors?" "The law is blind to emotion, Your Honor," Jenkins argued, leaning heavily on the table. "Need and ability to pay are the primary factors. Miss Hayes has the ability. Mr. Montgomery now clearly has the need." Arthur didn't laugh, but his eyes crinkled with genuine amusement. He slowly opened a third, significantly thicker manila folder. "Your Honor, we fully anticipated this rather shameless pivot. We do not deny that Mr. Montgomery is suddenly facing a severe liquidity crisis. However, we vehemently dispute the assertion that he is destitute, or that Miss Hayes owes him a single dime." Arthur signaled to his paralegal, who wheeled a small cart to the center of the room, loaded with bound ledgers. When Miss Hayes assumed majority control of Montgomery Holdings in 2020, she quietly initiated a comprehensive forensic audit of the company's operating accounts, Arthur explained, pulling the top ledger from the stack. "What we discovered was not just mismanagement, but systemic, brazen embezzlement." David's head snapped up. "Embezzlement? That's slander." "It is accounting, David," Arthur corrected. "Defense Exhibit D, Your Honor. The personal ledger of Mr. Montgomery's business expenses over the past 36 months. You will find that Mr. Montgomery utilized corporate funds legally belonging to the shareholders, namely my client, to finance a secondary, highly extravagant lifestyle." Arthur began to read from a highlighted sheet. Item, a 2-year lease on a penthouse apartment in the financial district, signed under a corporate subsidiary, utilized exclusively by Miss Jessica Pierce. Cost $14,000 a month. Item, a 2023 Mercedes G-Wagon, purchased under the company's fleet vehicle program, currently registered to and driven by Miss Pierce. Item, over $400,000 in jewelry, designer clothing, and first-class travel to Milan, St. Bart's, and Paris, all billed to the Montgomery Holdings Executive Entertainment account. Now, in the second row of the gallery, Jessica Pierce suddenly sat bolt upright. The oversized sunglasses could not hide the sheer panic blooming across her face. Over a period of 3 years, the petitioner misappropriated approximately $0.4 million of company capital to fund his infidelity, Arthur stated, his voice ringing through the silent room. Furthermore, under New York state law, the dissipation of marital assets for the purpose of carrying on an extramarital affair is grounds for an unequal distribution of remaining property. He has already spent his theoretical alimony, Your Honor. He spent it on Cartier bracelets and a penthouse for his mistress. Judge Caldwell's eyes flicked from the ledger to David, her expression one of utter disgust. Mr. Montgomery, did you charge a luxury vehicle for your Parama to your corporate fleet account? David's mouth opened and closed. He looked to Jenkins. Jenkins was staring blankly at the wall, mentally calculating his own malpractice insurance deductibles. It was a promotional expense, David stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. She's an influencer. It was brand visibility for the company. A Mercedes registered in her personal name is not a promotional expense, it is theft, Judge Caldwell snapped. She turned to Arthur. Mr. Eftrida Penhaligon, what is your motion regarding this? As the majority shareholder, my client has drafted a civil complaint for corporate fraud and embezzlement, Arthur said smoothly. However, Hayes is willing to waive criminal reporting and civil litigation regarding the stolen $2.4 million, provided Mr. Buth. Montgomery immediately waives any and all claims to spousal support, legal fee reimbursement, and the remaining joint checking accounts. Arthur turned slightly, allowing his gaze to sweep over the gallery. Of course, this waiver does not protect the recipient of those stolen funds. The company fully intends to repossess the G-Wagon and place a lien on the jewelry and designer goods illegally purchased with corporate money, unless Miss Pierce wishes to repay the $2.4 million herself. The reaction was instantaneous. Jessica Pierce did not scream. She did not cry. She simply engaged in a brutal, rapid calculus of self-preservation, realizing she was sitting on a mountain of stolen merchandise, legally tethered to a man who was now unemployed, broke, and facing civil fraud charges. Her decision was made in seconds. Jessica stood up. She grabbed her $300 matcha latte and her stolen Birkin bag. She did not look at David. She simply turned on her heel, the sharp clack of her Louboutins echoing off the mahogany walls, and walked out of the courtroom, letting the heavy oak doors slam shut behind her. David watched her go, his chest heaving. The woman he had blown up his life for hadn't even stayed for the afternoon recess. The heavy, unforgiving thud of the courtroom doors closing behind Jessica Pierce did not just echo through the high-ceilinged room. It seemed to sever the very last thread holding David Montgomery's fabricated reality together. For several long, agonizing seconds, no one spoke. The sharp, rapid clack of the young influencer's Louboutins fading down the marble corridor outside was the only sound accompanying the complete collapse of a titan. David slumped forward, his elbows hitting the plaintiff's table with a dull thud. He buried his face in his hands, his meticulously styled hair falling out of place. The arrogant, untouchable king of Manhattan real estate was entirely gone, replaced by a hollowed-out, trembling shell of a man finally comprehending the absolute totality of his ruin. He had blown up his life, his reputation, and his marriage for a girl who hadn't even stayed long enough to watch the afternoon recess. Beside him, Bradley Jenkins was engaged in a very different kind of panic. The bulldog litigator was staring at the wall, his mind a whirlwind of damage control and unpaid invoices. Jenkins was a predator, but he was a pragmatic one. He realized that his client was rapidly transitioning from a cash cow into a massive, insolvent liability. But Jenkins was also a man who refused to die in a courtroom without emptying his magazine. He took a sharp, ragged breath, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, and began frantically digging through his heavy leather briefcase. "Your Honor, if it please the court, we have one final overriding matter," Jenkins announced, his voice hoarse but suddenly injected with a desperate feral energy. He pulled out a faded, staple-bound document. It looked ancient compared to the crisp new financial ledgers Arthur had been parading around. The 2014 prenuptial agreement. David lifted his head from his hands. A weak, desperate spark of hope ignited in his bloodshot eyes. The prenup. He had almost forgotten about it in the avalanche of the morning's disaster. Even if this court has somehow found grounds to strip my client of his equity in Montgomery Holdings and the primary residence, Jenkins argued, aggressively waving the document, we have a binding ironclad agreement signed prior to the solemnization of this marriage. This document explicitly protects Mr. Pear. Montgomery's premarital investment portfolios, the seed money he earned before he even met Miss Hayes. Furthermore, it guarantees a baseline exit settlement of $5 million in the event of a dissolution, entirely regardless of fault. David sat up straighter, adjusting his tie with shaking fingers. $5 million. It was a fraction of the $42 million empire he had walked in with. But it was oxygen. $5 million was seed money, maybe seed. He still had his contacts, his industry knowledge, his name. With $5 million and his untouchable premarital stock portfolios, he could lease a small office, start a boutique firm, and claw his way back. He wasn't dead yet. He just had to survive this room. Ah, yes. The 2014 prenuptial agreement, Arthur Penhaligon sighed. The older lawyer pushed his chair back and stood up. He didn't look surprised. In fact, he looked almost melancholy, like a professor watching a student fail an open book exam. Your Honor, Mr. Jenkins is entirely correct. There is a prenuptial agreement, and it is indeed ironclad. The defense completely stipulates to its validity and its immediate enforcement. Jenkins blinked, his aggressive posture faltering. He gripped the edges of his podium, caught entirely off guard by the easy concession. You stipulate. We do. Arthur nodded, walking over to Caroline, who serenely handed him her own copy of the heavily tabbed document. Arthur approached the bench. Your Honor, this agreement was drafted heavily in Mr. Ben Montgomery's favor 12 years ago. At the time, his development company was just taking off. He was a very ambitious, very paranoid young man. He was deeply terrified that my client, despite her own significant established family wealth, was somehow marrying him for his rising trajectory. Arthur turned to look at David, his eyes filled with a terrifying, cold pity. David was very, very particular about protecting his personal brand. He insisted on a highly specific punitive morality clause to ensure his new wife could never embarrass him. Mr. Jenkins, would you be so kind as to turn to page 14? Please read section 4, paragraph C aloud for the court. Jenkins hesitated. He looked down at the document in his hands. As his eyes darted across the dense legal text, the remaining color violently drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old ash. He slowly closed the folder, swallowing hard. Your Honor, I don't believe reading this aloud is strictly necessary for the proceedings. Read it, Mr. Jenkins, Judge Caldwell commanded, leaning so far forward over the bench she was practically looming over the courtroom. Her patience had entirely evaporated. Read it into the record right now, or I will have the bailiff read it for you. Jenkins cleared his throat. The sound was like grinding glass. He opened the folder again. In the event that the marriage is dissolved due to the documented public infidelity of either party. Jenkins paused, his voice trembling slightly. Keep going, Counselor, Arthur urged politely, clasping his hands behind his back. Jenkins gripped the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white, which results in demonstrably negative media attention, public humiliation, or reputational damage to the non-offending spouse. The offending party shall immediately forfeit any and all rights to the baseline exit settlement. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. David's eyes widened. The oxygen instantly sucked back out of his lungs. Furthermore, Jenkins croaked, finishing the clause, The offending party shall surrender all claims to their premarital investment portfolios, transferring sole unencumbered ownership of said portfolios to the non-offending spouse as liquidated damages for reputational harm. Arthur adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and turned to face the gallery, speaking clearly and deliberately. David drafted this exact clause, Your Honor. He wanted to ensure that if Caroline ever humiliated him in the press, he could ruin her financially. He was so utterly terrified of public embarrassment that he created a legal guillotine designed to sever the offender from every dime they possessed. Nada, sai, fall, sai. Arthur gestured toward the empty gallery seat where Jessica had been sitting. 3 months ago, Mr. Montgomery engaged in a highly explicit sexual encounter while wearing a live active microphone during the Monroe Foundation Gala, a charity gala that was actively live-streamed to over 2 million unique viewers. The recording of his promises to his mistress was subsequently broadcast on every major news network, tabloid, and social media platform in the country. Arthur turned back to the judge, his voice ringing with absolute finality. We formally submit the audio and video recordings of the gala as Defense Exhibit E. We assert that this undeniably constitutes documented public infidelity, resulting in demonstrably negative media attention and severe reputational damage to my client. David was trembling violently now, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You can't do this. Those were my accounts before I even met her. That's my money. You can't take my past. It was your money, Mr. Montgomery, Judge Caldwell corrected, her voice cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of sympathy. You signed a contract, you dictated the terms. You built the guillotine to threaten your wife, and then you willingly, arrogantly placed your own head inside it while wearing a hot microphone. The judge picked up her heavy wooden gavel. She looked down at the ruined developer with an expression of profound disgust. Based on the irrefutable, overwhelming evidence presented today, the court finds the petitioner, David Montgomery, in gross, undeniable violation of the morality clause outlined in the 2014 prenuptial agreement. The baseline settlement of $5 million is hereby rendered null and void. Furthermore, all premarital investment portfolios listed in Schedule A are immediately transferred to the respondent, Caroline Hayes, as liquidated damages. Judge Caldwell stacked her files neatly, her eyes locking onto David's pale face. Mr. Montgomery, you came into my courtroom today attempting to enforce a fraud and steal a home. You leave this marriage with precisely what you deserve, the clothes on your back, and the consequences of your own staggering arrogance. The petition for division of assets is denied. The divorce is granted, heavily weighted in favor of the respondent due to extreme financial dissipation and contractual violation. She struck the sounding block with a resounding, deafening crack. Court is adjourned. Silence hung heavy in the courtroom, broken only by the rustle of Judge Caldwell gathering her files and the soft click of her chamber door shutting behind her. The legal execution was complete. David Montgomery remained glued to his chair, staring blankly at the mahogany grain of the table. His mind, usually a rapid-fire engine of acquisitions and leverage, was entirely blank. He had walked into this building 4 hours ago as a titan of Manhattan real estate, a millionaire demanding his rightful spoils. He was walking out as a legally recognized fraudster. Stripped of his company, his $6.5 million estate, his mistress, and his premarital fortune. Next to him, Bradley Jenkins was snapping his briefcase shut with aggressive finality. The lawyer did not offer a comforting pat on the shoulder or a whispered strategy for an appeal. Bradley, David croaked, his voice sounding like it belonged to a much older, frailer man. We need to file an injunction. We need to freeze her trust. There has to be a loophole. Jenkins paused, his hand resting on the brass latch of his leather case. He looked down at his former client with an expression of profound professional exhaustion. David, there is no loophole. You committed textbook fraudulent conveyance on the house. You legally signed away majority control of your business to save yourself from bankruptcy. and you publicly violated an ironclad prenuptial agreement that you yourself demanded she sign. I cannot fight your own signatures, and I certainly cannot fight them for free." "I'll pay you," David snapped, a flash of his old arrogance surfacing. "When the dust settles, I'll rebuild." "I'm still David Montgomery." "No, you're not," Jenkins replied coldly. "You're a liability, and given that your only remaining assets are frozen under a corporate embezzlement investigation, my firm will be dropping you as a client effective immediately. I suggest you find a very cheap public defender for the civil fraud suit your wife is drafting." "Goodbye, David." Jenkins turned and walked briskly down the center aisle, not looking back. Left entirely alone, David finally forced himself to stand. His legs felt like lead. As he turned toward the gallery exit, he saw Caroline. She was standing near the heavy oak doors with her attorney, Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur was quietly sliding files into a battered canvas satchel, looking like a grandfather packing up after a mild afternoon at the library. Caroline stood perfectly straight, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her navy blue dress. She looked serene, unbothered. David felt a sudden blinding surge of irrational rage. He closed the distance between them, his fists clenched at his sides. "You planned this," David hissed, his voice echoing in the empty, cavernous room. "You sat there for 3 years, knowing you held the strings to my company, and you just smiled and poured my coffee." Caroline turned to face him, her expression infuriatingly calm. "I didn't plan your financial mismanagement, David. Nor did I force you to siphon shareholder capital to buy jewelry for a 22-year-old girl. I simply protected my family's legacy from your incompetence." "The prenup," David pushed closer, his face inches from hers. "You took my seed money, the money I made before I even knew your name. It's theft." Arthur Penhaligon cleared his throat, stepping smoothly between them. "I would advise you to monitor your volume, Mr. Montgomery, and your physical proximity. The bailiffs are still in the hallway." David ignored the old lawyer, keeping his bloodshot eyes locked on his ex-wife. It was a freak accident, a hot microphone at a charity gala, a 1-in-a-million stroke of bad luck. If that documentary crew hadn't left their feed running, you would have gotten nothing. I would have walked away with half. Caroline tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he were a particularly slow-witted child. A faint, chilling smile touched the corners of her lips. "David," she said softly, her voice carrying the velvet weight of old money and absolute power. "You have always been so utterly obsessed with the spotlight, you never bothered to look at who was paying for the electricity." David frowned, the anger momentarily derailed by confusion. "What are you talking about?" "The Monroe Foundation Gala," Caroline clarified, her tone conversational. "It was a beautiful event, but charities are always so desperate for sponsors, especially for unglamorous things like audio-visual production and live-streaming logistics." A cold, heavy dread began to pool in the pit of David's stomach. "Who do you think sponsored the documentary crew?" Caroline asked, her eyes devoid of any warmth. "Who do you think hired the specific AV company that just so happened to leave a roaming microphone active in the supposedly secluded alcove you frequented every year?" David physically took a step back, the breath rushing from his lungs. "No, you couldn't have." "The AV company is a subsidiary of Apex Media," Arthur chimed in helpfully, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "which, as it turns out, is entirely owned by the Caroline Hayes Trust. My client knew about Miss Pierce for 8 months, David, but filing for a quiet, private divorce wouldn't have triggered the morality clause you so arrogantly drafted in 2014. She needed you to be precisely who you are, a narcissist who believes he is untouchable in front of the entire world." "Not Trent Audis." David stared at the woman he had been married to for 12 years, realizing with terrifying clarity that he had never actually known her at all. She hadn't just beaten him, she had engineered his self-destruction. She had built the maze, placed the cheese, and watched him eagerly snap his own neck in the trap. "You're a monster," David whispered, his voice trembling. "No, David," Caroline replied, turning toward the heavy oak doors. "I am simply a meticulous businesswoman. You taught me that you have to protect the capital. I just protected mine." She pushed the door open. The immediate roar of the paparazzi waiting in the marble hallway flooded the room. Camera flashes exploded like lightning, capturing the pale, ruined face of the former Titan standing in the shadows and the poised, untouchable silhouette of the woman walking out into the light. Revenge is rarely a screaming match in the rain. The most devastating victories are executed in absolute silence, buried beneath layers of legal ink and undeniable patience. David Montgomery's catastrophic downfall serves as a chilling reminder that arrogance is a liability, and the people you underestimate are often the architects of your undoing. He thought he was playing the board, never realizing his quiet wife actually owned the entire casino. If this masterclass in legal karma and stealth wealth strategy left you completely speechless, make sure to hit that like button to appease the algorithm. Share this video with anyone who needs a harsh reminder to always read the fine print, and drop a comment below telling us which courtroom twist shocked you the most. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another unbelievable, real-life story of justice served ice cold.